So let's talk about a generic database service. The reason I want to talk about this is in almost every project that I do, that I create with, all right, let's talk about a generic database service. And the reason is because in almost every project that I do, I end up creating this generic database service because I want to wrapper around my database context. So in the standard way of what you might have seen in documentation is let's say you've created an ASP.NET Core website and you want to use your database. Well, what you do is you install Entity Framework Core, uh, you create your DB context, you give yourself a DB set with an entity inside, and then you jump over to whatever a controller, let's say, and you inject your DB context, right? You do it this way. Let's get the field going. Okay, now I have access to my DB context. I can use it throughout my controller, and you've got all of your typical Entity Framework stuff that you can use. So this is great for websites, and it works well because the lifetime of your database context is going to be controlled by the request lifecycle. So that means that after every request, your database context is going to be disposed, which, like I said, works really well for websites. But let's talk about maybe you've got a console app or a service or something that runs a little bit longer than your typical request lifecycle. What happens then? Well, your database context is going to keep tracking, and eventually it's going to blow up. It's going to get out of memory. So if you want to do that, just maybe you get in the habit of controlling your own database lifecycle, and that's what I've done, and just makes me feel a little bit more comfortable, and lets me know that I have a little more control over that lifetime. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like a database service. So let's go ahead and create an interface to talk about what it is that we expect our database service to do. So public interface, database service. Okay. All right. So we talk about what a database service should do, what we expect it to do. Is really we expect two different things. We expect a command, which is going to be your adds, updates, and deletes. So let's go ahead and add that in command. And then whenever you do an add, update, or delete, Entity Framework usually returns an integer which represents the number of rows that were affected. So we'll just have this return an int for now. And what do we want the command to pass in? Really, we only want to control the lifetime of the database. So we're going to open the database, create the database, and we're going to close the database. Whatever's in between, we don't care. We're going to let the caller do that. So we're going to use inversion of control here. And so the way you can do that is just letting the caller pass in a func. So we're going to expose our database context just like this, and we're going to expect the caller to return an int. We'll just call that command for now. Okay, that's it. That's your command function. And then we also need the query function, which this is going to allow the caller to get data out of the database, request database, or query data for that. So what is it going to return? Well, usually you think of a query returning a list of records. So you might say like list of, I don't know, my entity. Maybe that's something that you're considering. And then you will say, well, same thing. We want inversion of control here. So we'll have a func of my DB context maybe. And then we expect it to return a list of my entity. So maybe this is what we're thinking. And this is a really raw version of what might be a database service function. But you'll notice that you need to rewrite this for every single query, for every entity. That's not very great. So let's go ahead and just change this to something more generic. We can use this term T like this, and capital T is what I usually use. You don't have to use capital T. You can use pretty much any character that you want. I like T. It's the standard. So usually T within carets within less than greater than, that usually notates generic. So maybe we change this to T as well. So now we're passing in a list of T where T is our entity type. So this looks good, and this is still a little bit constraining because, I don't know, maybe you want to return a single or something. So you could add another method, maybe call it find, and it just finds a single record. But I actually prefer to be less constrained, and this way I let the caller return whatever in the world they want. I just care about opening and closing the database context. Okay, so what's the implementation look like? Database, let's create a class, database service. Obviously it's going to, class. Obviously it's going to implement database service, no big deal. All right, so let's get the implementation here. Okay, so this actually is going to be pretty simple. Let's do this, and we're going to create a database context using the disposable pattern. So using var db equals new, create the database, do whatever we want inside, which we really don't care at this point. We're letting the caller do it. So all we care is to expose that database to the command, to the caller. So this is it, and then let's make sure we return the integer here. So here you go. This is the command. So now it's exactly like it was before with using the injected database, but we are specifically controlling the creation and closing of the database. So this is more of what you'd consider maybe it's not exactly what you might consider a transient lifetime, but it feels more like a transient lifetime. Every time someone or every time a caller makes a command, we're creating the database and getting rid of the database. This isn't always ideal, but it does give us a really, really scoped database context. You might want to track your database changes over the course of multiple commands or multiple queries. So that's something different. So if that's what you want, this is probably not the implementation for you, but still, this is good to know. So let's see. Same thing for query. We just open it up, run our query, and we're done. One little thing that I typically like to change here is I like to return here db.savechanges. That way, kind of redundant to use that a lot because every time someone uses a command, then obviously they're going to call save changes if they want to actually write it to the database. So you can just put that here, and then whenever you use command, you don't have to worry about calling save changes anymore. Oh, this one should be query. All right, so now we're returning our query, and that's pretty simple. Okay, great. So what does this actually look like if you're going to use it in a controller, for example? So if you jump over to our controller, instead of injecting dbcontext, and keep in mind maybe this is a console class or some service that sits in a long-running process somewhere. So instead of my dbcontext, maybe we're looking at database service, just like that. We'll name this db service, I guess. That's fine. db service. And then what's this complaining about? There. All right, great. So now instead of just having direct access, we have to access everything through this service. So db service dot. And now you can see we've got our command and our query. So if you want to do a command, you could open up the command and go db dot and then do whatever you want. So maybe it's db.add and then you add a string or something. I don't know. Whatever you can come up with, and then there you go. It just goes right to the database. On the side, you might want to use query. So query is a little bit different. So you use your query, and then it's going to try to figure out what entity type you want. So right now, it's just using capital T. It doesn't know what entity type we want. But if you do db.myEntities.toList, it should return a list of my entity. And if you hover it now, yes, so it did replace that capital T with my entity. So it's figuring it out. var records equals db service. Great. So this is awesome. This gives us a really, really nice, compact, isolated scope to our database service. Obviously, there's some optimizations you can make based on your situation. Like you can pass a parameter that tells it when to open or close the database. But the idea is there that the database service is controlling the lifetime of our database. So let's do one little extra thing here. Is that maybe your DB context has some properties or some config injection or something that you want to take advantage of. So for example, maybe you have a connection string that you want to pass in here. So you could just, pass your connection string directly in and then handle it within your DB context. So let's say your DB context takes a wonderful string here, string const string, and then it does something with it. We don't care at this point, but it does something with it and uses it later. Builds your connection based on that string. So that's pretty common. So you could just pass it like this, but actually I prefer to make this into a factory. So let's do that quick. And let's see, public class db. Let's just call it a dbcontext factory for now. And this is going to have some configuration. So let's just do configuration. It's pretty common, I think. So we'll call it config, and then we'll do that, inject it through a field. Okay, so now we just need to do I usually, for factories, I just have a create method. So the create method is going to return what we would think dbcontext, or in this case, my dbcontext, right? It's going to return my dbcontext, and it's not going to take anything in. We don't need anything at this point. And then you can create a new my dbcontext, and you have to pass the connection string. But the connection string, we can pull that in from the config right here, dot connection string, and then I don't know, whatever it is that you named your connection string, you would have to pull that out of I'm assuming your app settings or your web config somehow and get that in here. So this is great because it sort of decouples your dbcontext from the how do I get my connection string. So if you wanted to pull this in through iConfiguration, or if you wanted to hard code it, or if you wanted to get it from the database, or it doesn't matter, you could pull all that in your web config. Maybe you could pull it in however you want through a factory. You could swap out your factories and all that wonderful jargon. So let's make this public, and then instead of using our new dbcontext here, we would rather use our factory. So that takes some injection as well. So let's inject our factory, and we can just use this guy right here, dot create. That should work. There, nice. Now the person who invokes this create method should know that this is a disposable. That should be pretty obvious. So just keep in mind that needs to be used inside of a using, just like before. Okay, no big deal. And then the last thing is you might try to run this. I'm going to move this to its own file. You might try to run this and you'll get a container issue because these things aren't registered. So the last thing would be to jump over to your startup file, which all your ASP.NET Core apps are going to have. And you might go in your configure services and say services.register. I think it's add, actually. Add singleton, that's right. And you've got your database service. And you're going to inject database service. Great, so now we're letting our container do that for us. One more thing is we'll have to register our factory. So database service factory. I think that should be there. What did I call it? dbcontext factory? db factory? Let's take a look. dbcontext factory. There we go. Oops. Startup file. db factory. There we go. Okay, so now you have your registrations and you're good to go. So I hope this was helpful to you, and I hope that it creates more maintainable software in the future. And let me know if you have any optimizations or if you do it any different way that you find that actually works better for you. All right, thanks for watching.